So, you came back. Good. Because what I'm about to tell you in this second part is even more devastating than what you learned in part 1. You remember where we left off, right? March 1943. The He-280 canceled, all hopes now resting on the Me-262, a jet fighter that's still plagued with problems, still months, maybe years away from being combat ready. And Germany's military situation, it's deteriorating fast. Quick reminder before we dive in, if you haven't watched part 1 yet, click the screen right now and go watch it, because what happens next won't make sense without understanding how Germany squandered its 2-year head start in jet fighter technology. I'll wait. Okay, you're back. Let's talk about 1943, 1944, and the final desperate months of the war. July 25th, 1943. Hamburg. The British launch Operation Gomorrah, a series of bombing raids that will kill 42,000 civilians and destroy much of the city. They're using a new tactic, dropping strips of aluminum foil called window that completely blinds German radar. The Luftwaffe's night fighters fly in circles, unable to find the bombers, unable to stop the devastation. This is what Germany is facing now, not the triumphant advances of 1940 and 1941, but defense, retreat, survival. And the Luftwaffe. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter arm was fighting a losing battle. Unable to cope with the swarms of long-range American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, it was quickly being destroyed. The P-51 Mustang. Let me tell you about this aircraft because it's crucial to understanding why the Me-262 came too late. The development of drop tanks and the eventual positioning of P-51s on the European mainland gave the fighters more airtime over Germany. These American fighters could now escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German fighters that used to be able to attack bomber formations without interference now had to fight through screens of Mustangs. And here's what really hurt. In 1944, fighter pilots were often given the green light to go in before the bombers and destroy anything that moved, especially the jets rising to meet the slow-moving bombers. The Mustangs didn't just escort bombers anymore. They hunted. They strafed airfields, shot up locomotives, destroyed aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe was being bled white. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. New pilots were being sent into combat with minimal training, sometimes less than 100 hours of flight time, while Allied pilots had 300, 400, sometimes 500 hours before they saw combat. And fuel. Fuel was becoming a critical problem. The synthetic fuel plants, the refineries, they were primary targets for Allied bombers. Without fuel, it didn't matter how many aircraft you had. They were just expensive pieces of metal sitting on the ground. This is the situation in mid-1944 when the Me-262 finally starts to trickle into operational service. But remember what I told you in part 1. Hitler's insistence that it be a bomber. That's still causing massive problems. Let me take you inside one of these debates because it shows you just how disconnected from reality the Nazi leadership had become. May 1944. Hitler was furious when he discovered that his orders for the Me-262 to be used as a fighter bomber had been ignored. He screams at Goering, at Galland, at anyone within earshot. "This is the Blitz bomber I ordered," he shouts. "Why has it taken so long? Why has no one obeyed my commands?" Galland tries to explain. He tries to tell Hitler that the aircraft's true value is as an interceptor, as a fighter that can break up bomber formations, that can challenge Allied air superiority. But Hitler, he's not listening. He's thinking about revenge. He's thinking about striking back at England, at the invasion beaches, at Allied supply lines. Hitler's decree effectively stopped fighter production and made the development of a bombing version priority. Think about that. Germany is being bombed around the clock. Allied bombers are destroying their cities, their factories, their ability to wage war, and Hitler orders them to stop producing fighters. But there's something else going on here, something deeper that you need to understand about why the Me-262 program was such a disaster. The engines. We talked about them in part 1, but I need to really drive this home because this is the Me-262's fatal flaw, the thing that made it ultimately a failure despite its incredible potential. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet had an average lifespan of just 25 hours. Now let me put that in perspective for you. A typical American fighter engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 and a P-47 Thunderbolt, that engine could run for 500, sometimes 600 hours before needing major overhaul. The Merlin engine in a P-51 Mustang, 300 to 400 hours. The Jumo 004, 25 hours. Why? Because Germany didn't have the materials they needed. To withstand the incredible heat and pressures involved, the manufacture of jet engine components required metals like nickel and cobalt, materials which were simply unavailable in quantity to the Germans at the time. So they used substitutes, hollow turbine blades made from mild steel instead of solid blades made from heat-resistant alloys. They worked for a while, and then they failed. The engine suffered from decreased thrust at high altitude, fuel flow problems, and flameouts if the throttle was opened or closed too quickly. Imagine you're a German pilot, you're sitting in an Me-262, you've got four 30mm cannons, you're faster than anything the Allies have, and you see a formation of B-17s ahead of you. You line up your attack run, you start to accelerate, and you need to push the throttle forward to get more speed. But you can't do it too quickly or your engine will flame out. You have to ease it forward, smoothly, carefully, while American gunners are already tracking you, already firing. And landing? Landing was a nightmare. The designers hadn't thought of how to slow down these incredibly fast airplanes, and no air brakes were fitted. You had to do a long, slow approach to landing, and this was an Achilles heel, because the 8th USAAF Mustangs realized this, and Me-262s were picked off usually in that phase of the operation. Allied fighter aircraft would patrol above known Me-262 bases. They would wait, and when the jets came in to land, slow, engines throttled back, vulnerable, the Mustangs would dive down and shoot them out of the sky. It was brutal, it was effective, and it showed that even the most advanced technology in the world couldn't overcome fundamental tactical disadvantages. Now, let me tell you about the men who flew these jets, because their stories, they're remarkable. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, he was so frustrated with the delays, with the bureaucracy, with Hitler's interference, that he requested to be relieved of his command so he could return to flying combat missions. In early 1945, Galland formed Jagdverband 44, an elite unit of experienced pilots flying Me-262s. These weren't inexperienced kids fresh out of flight school. These were veterans, aces, men who had survived years of combat. The unit included some of Germany's most famous pilots, many of them holders of the Knight's Cross. And they were effective. When they got into the air, when the engines worked, when they had fuel, when they weren't ambushed during takeoff or landing, they were deadly. But there were never enough of them. Despite around 1,433 Me-262 fighters being delivered, only about 300 saw combat. Why so few? Because of all the problems we've been talking about. Engine failures, fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, Allied bombing of factories, Allied strafing of airfields, and the simple fact that building a jet fighter was far more complex and time-consuming than building a conventional fighter. Let me give you a specific example of what Me-262 pilots faced, because it illustrates both the aircraft's potential and its limitations. On March 18, 1945, Me-262s from Jagdgeschwader 7 intercepted a large formation of American bombers. The jets tore into the formation, their 30mm cannons ripping through the bomber's aluminum skin. They downed 12 bombers for the loss of just 3 jets. It was a devastating attack, a 4-to-1 kill ratio, the kind of success that showed what the Me-262 could have achieved if it had been available in larger numbers earlier in the war. But this is March 1945. Berlin will fall in 6 weeks. The war is already over. Everyone knows it, except maybe Hitler and the most fanatical Nazis. So those 12 bombers that were shot down, they made no difference to the outcome. The next day, more bombers came, and the day after that, and the day after that. Despite its short time in combat, the Me-262 accounted for 542 Allied aircraft destroyed while losing 100. That's a 5-to-1 kill ratio, which is extraordinary. But think about the math. 542 Allied aircraft destroyed. Sounds impressive, right? Except the Allies were producing thousands of aircraft every month. They could absorb those losses without even noticing. There were probably never more than 36 Me-262s in the air at any one time, when the Allies customarily put 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters over the ruins of Germany. 36 jets against 1,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters. It's not even a fair fight. It's not even close. And the Allied pilots? They adapted. That's what you have to understand. The Allies weren't stupid. When they first encountered the Me-262, yes, there was fear, there was anxiety. Nothing they had could match its speed. But they learned. Allied pilots discovered that while the Me-262 was faster in a straight line, it couldn't turn as tightly as a Mustang or a Spitfire. So if you were being pursued by a jet, you didn't try to outrun it. You turned into it. You forced it into a turning fight where your aircraft had the advantage. And if you were hunting jets, you waited near their airfields, you watched for them to take off or land, and you attacked when they were most vulnerable. It was called ratcatcher patrols, and they were brutally effective. There's a quote from an American P-51 pilot. I wish I could remember his name, but he said something like, shooting down a 262 on the ground counted just as much as shooting one down in the air, and it was a hell of a lot safer. Now, while all this is happening with the Me-262, there's another jet program going on, one that's even more desperate, even more rushed, even more indicative of how far Germany had fallen. Remember Ernst Heinkel, the man whose HE-280 was canceled in 1943? Well, in 1944, he gets another chance, sort of. Concerned with the slow production of the Me-262, the German High Command wanted a so-called rush job, a single-engine jet fighter that required little strategic materials to build. The HE-162, the People's Fighter, the Volksjäger. The concept was insane. Build a jet fighter so simple, so easy to manufacture, that Germany could produce thousands of them using semi-skilled labor, using non-strategic materials like wood and steel instead of aluminum. And these aircraft would be flown by Hitler Youth, by teenagers with minimal training, with just enough flight instruction to get into the air and ram Allied bombers. Yes, ram them. That was actually part of the plan. Adolf Galland said that the HE-162 was unrealistic. To mass-produce such a crude and untried aircraft and expect it to be flown by inexperienced Hitler Youth was beyond reality. But reality? Reality had left the building at this point. We're talking about September 1944. The Soviets are approaching Germany's eastern borders. The Western Allies are pushing through France. German cities are being bombed into rubble, and the Nazi leadership is talking about teenagers flying wooden jet fighters. The HE-162 mock-up was ready just 12 days after the specification had been issued. On September 23, 1944, it was selected for mass production. The HE-162 was an interesting aircraft, actually. From an engineering perspective, it was clever. The jet engine was mounted on top of the fuselage above the cockpit, drawing air from an intake on the spine. This configuration avoided the need for long intake ducts. It simplified the design. It made construction easier. The wings were wooden. The fuselage was steel and wood with minimal aluminum. The first prototype flew on December 6, 1944. 4 days later, during a high-speed test flight, the aircraft broke up in midair, killing the test pilot. The problem? The glue holding the wooden wings together had failed. They fixed it, or thought they did, and pushed on with production. Using slave labor, about 100 aircraft were produced in February 1945. Let me pause here and talk about slave labor, because it's important. By 1944-1945, a huge portion of German aircraft production was being done by forced laborers, by concentration camp prisoners, by people working under the most horrific conditions imaginable. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, and others were relying heavily on slaves to keep production going. And you know what happens when you force people to build weapons for their oppressors? Sabotage. Subtle sabotage, the kind that's hard to detect. A bolt not quite tightened enough. A fuel line connection that'll leak after a few hours of vibration. Glue that's slightly contaminated so it won't hold under stress. How many German aircraft failed because of sabotage? We'll never know for sure, but I guarantee you it was more than zero. And the HE-162, with its rushed development, its reliance on non-traditional materials, its use of slave labor, it suffered from quality control problems that made it almost as dangerous to its pilots as it was to Allied bombers. On February 6, 1945, the first group converted to the new type. But by this point, there's almost no fuel. There are almost no experienced pilots to train the new ones. The airfields are being constantly strafed by Allied fighters, and the war is weeks away from being over. In the final weeks of the war, the so-called People's Fighter saw little action. Combat claims were made, but never confirmed. Only one HE-162 was ever shot down by an Allied fighter. One out of hundreds produced. That tells you how few actually flew combat missions. On May 5th, Germany surrendered. It was over. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. And all their wonder weapons, their jets and their rockets, their Me-262s and HE-162s and V-1s and V-2s, none of it had made any difference. Now, let's step back and ask the big question, the question everyone asks when they learn about German jet fighters. Could it have changed the outcome of the war? If the HE-280 had entered production in early 1943, if the Me-262 hadn't been delayed by Hitler's interference, by engine problems, by bureaucratic chaos, if Germany had fielded hundreds of jet fighters a year or two earlier than they did, could they have won? The short answer? No, probably not. But let me explain why, because it's not as simple as you might think. First, the strategic situation. By 1943, Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts against enemies with far greater industrial capacity. The Soviet Union was mobilizing its vast resources. The United States was ramping up production to levels Germany couldn't hope to match. Even if jet fighters had stopped the Allied bombing campaign, even if they'd prevented the invasion of Normandy, Germany would still be losing in the east. The Soviets would still be pushing toward Berlin. Second, resources. Building jet fighters required materials Germany didn't have enough of: nickel, cobalt, chrome for the engines, aluminum for the airframes, high-octane fuel, rubber for tires, lubricating oil. Every resource Germany needed was in short supply by 1943, 1944. The strategic materials they needed to contain heat stresses in the engines simply weren't available in quantity. Third, trained pilots. By 1944, Germany was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train new ones. You can build all the advanced aircraft you want, but if you don't have skilled pilots to fly them, they're worthless. And training pilots takes time, fuel, and instructors, all of which Germany was running out of. Fourth, and this is crucial, defense doesn't win wars. Even if German jet fighters had successfully defended German airspace, had stopped the Allied bombing campaign, had maintained air superiority over Germany, then what? Germany would still be on the defensive. They would still be losing territory. They would still be running out of resources. At best, Jets could have prolonged the war. They couldn't have won it. But, and this is important, they could have changed how the war ended. They could have made the Allied bombing campaign far more costly, far more difficult. They could have forced the Allies to rethink their strategy. A sky full of HE-280s might have prevented the U.S. 8th Air Force from building up its bomber offensive over Europe, and might even have forced the Allies to postpone the invasion of occupied Europe. More time would have meant more German defensive preparations. It would have meant the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs having more time to develop. It would have meant Germany's nuclear program, which was nowhere near producing a bomb, but was making progress in some areas, having more time. But here's the thing, and this is what a lot of people miss when they talk about German wonder weapons. Technology alone doesn't win wars. You need production capacity, you need resources, you need logistics, you need trained personnel, you need strategic coherence, you need leadership that makes rational decisions based on reality, not fantasy. And Nazi Germany? It had none of those things. Not really. Not where it mattered. After 1936, Nazi management of the aviation industry was not centralized. Udet's technical office, Goering, the general staff, Milch, and all the aircraft designers jockeyed with one another for control of the aviation program. Airman Goering was corrupt, incompetent. He had no business running the Luftwaffe. He appointed his friends to positions they weren't qualified for. He lied to Hitler about production capabilities. He played political games while the Luftwaffe was being destroyed. Ernst Udet, brilliant pilot, terrible administrator, was completely out of his depth. He shot himself in the head in November 1941 because he couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't fix the problems, couldn't reconcile the gap between what he was supposed to deliver and what was actually possible. Erhard Milch was competent at increasing production numbers, but he was conservative, risk-averse, unwilling to disrupt existing programs to introduce new technology. And Hitler's insistence that the Me-262 be a bomber rather than a fighter delayed its deployment and reduced its effectiveness. This is why the HE-280 was canceled. This is why the Me-262 came too late. This is why Germany lost the air war. Not because they lacked technology. They had the most advanced aviation technology in the world. Not because they lacked talented engineers. Heinkel and Messerschmitt and the Jumo engine designers were brilliant. Not because they lacked brave pilots. The Luftwaffe had some of the best pilots in the world. They lost because their system was rotten, because their leadership was incompetent, because they made irrational decisions based on politics and personal rivalries and Hitler's delusions rather than military necessity. Let me tell you one more story that illustrates this perfectly. After the war ended, Allied intelligence teams fanned out across Germany searching for advanced technology, for documents, for anything that could help them understand how far German science had progressed. Captain Eric Brown, a British test pilot, was one of the people tasked with evaluating captured German aircraft. When he flew the HE-280 for Ernst Heinkel in a post-war demonstration, Heinkel was like a schoolboy, jumping up and down with delight, asking very piercing questions about the handling of the aircraft. And Captain Brown found that the Germans had left their advanced aircraft completely intact. The jets were left absolutely untouched, and Brown was puzzled about this. What had motivated them not to destroy these aircraft? He concluded that deep down it was a sense of pride in what they had achieved in the technical field, and they wanted the Allies to see it. Think about that for a moment. The war is lost. Germany is occupied. Millions are dead. Cities are in ruins. And German engineers are preserving their jet aircraft so the Allies can see them, so they can say, look what we built, look what we achieved. Pride, technical achievement, scientific advancement, all of it useless because it came too late, because it was mismanaged, because the system that created it was fundamentally broken. Now, what happened to these German jets after the war? The Allies grabbed everything they could. The Americans took Me-262s, HE-162s, design documents, engineers. The British did the same. The Soviets captured entire factories, entire design bureaus, and shipped them back to the Soviet Union. And all of them, Americans, British, French, Soviets, they all started their own jet programs based on what they learned from Germany. The swept-wing design of the Me-262 influenced the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, the British Hawker Hunter. The lessons learned from German jet engine development accelerated Allied jet programs by years. In a weird way, Germany's jet fighters did change aviation history, just not in the way Hitler and Goering and the Luftwaffe High Command imagined. Not by winning the war for Germany, but by giving the Allies a blueprint for the jet age. And Ernst Heinkel? He remained bitter about the cancellation of the HE-280 until his death. The man who built the world's first jet aircraft in 1939, the HE-178. The man who built the world's first jet fighter in 1941, the HE-280. He never got the recognition he deserved. His greatest achievements were ignored, canceled, forgotten. Messerschmitt got the contracts, got the fame, got his name in the history books as the designer of the Me-262, the fighter that was too late but at least saw combat. Heinkel got nothing, just bitterness and the knowledge that he'd been right, that his aircraft could have made a difference if only someone had listened. There's a larger lesson here, beyond the specific history of jet fighters, beyond World War II. It's about the relationship between technology and war, between innovation and strategy, between what's possible and what's practical. Technology alone doesn't win wars. The Germans had the best tanks in many categories, the Tiger, the Panther. They had the best heavy fighters, the FW-19. They had the first jet fighters, the first cruise missiles, the first ballistic missiles. They had talented engineers, brilliant scientists, innovative designers. And they lost, decisively. Completely. Because war isn't about having the best individual weapons. It's about having enough weapons, having the logistics to support them, having the trained personnel to use them effectively, having the industrial base to produce them in quantity, having the strategic resources to sustain a long campaign. It's about making rational decisions, about understanding your limitations, about not letting fantasy and ideology blind you to reality. Nazi Germany failed at all of those things. Their jet fighter program is just one example, but it's a perfect example of how a combination of incompetence, arrogance, political interference, and strategic blindness can turn a potential war-winning technology into an expensive footnote. So when you hear someone say, if only Germany had gotten their jets into production sooner, they could have won the war, remember what I've told you. Remember the Jumo 004 engines that lasted 25 hours. Remember the shortage of nickel and cobalt. Remember the lack of trained pilots and fuel. Remember Hitler insisting the Me-262 be a bomber. Remember Goering's incompetence and Judith's suicide and Milch's conservatism. Remember the chaos of Nazi aircraft production, with multiple companies building overlapping designs with no coordination or efficiency. Could earlier jet fighters have prolonged the war? Maybe. Could they have made the Allied bombing campaign more difficult and costly? Probably. Could they have changed the outcome? Almost certainly not. Because by the time jet fighters could have made a difference, by 1943 or 1944, Germany was already losing. The Soviet Union was mobilizing millions of troops. American factories were producing tens of thousands of aircraft. The industrial and demographic imbalance was simply too great. And that's the real tragedy of the HE-280, the Me-262, and Germany's entire jet program. Not that they failed to win the war, that was probably impossible regardless, but that they came so close to success, only to be destroyed by the same incompetence and irrationality that doomed Nazi Germany as a whole. 9 HE-280 prototypes built, the world's first jet fighter, 2 years ahead of anything the Allies had, and it never fired a shot in combat. It never intercepted a bomber. It never proved what it could do. Although it failed to reach production status after losing out to the more aerodynamically advanced Me-262, the HE-280 did set several firsts. It was the first jet fighter designed from scratch, the first to fly, the first with a tricycle landing gear, The first with an ejection seat, which actually saved test pilot Helmut Schenk's life in an emergency, making it the first successful use of an ejection seat in history. All those firsts, all that innovation, all that potential, wasted. And the Me-262? 542 Allied aircraft destroyed, for 100 Me-262s lost in combat. Impressive numbers, but too few aircraft, too late in the war, with too many problems, against an enemy that had already won. If you're wondering what could have been, if Germany had made different choices, if the HE-280 had entered production in 1943, if the Me-262 hadn't been delayed, the answer is, we'll never know for sure. History doesn't give us do-overs. We can speculate, we can analyze, we can learn from the mistakes that were made. And the mistakes, they were enormous, catastrophic. The kind of mistakes that military historians study to understand how not to develop new weapons, how not to manage industrial production, how not to let politics override military necessity. So here's what you should take away from this two-part series. Germany had a 2-year head start in jet fighter technology. They squandered it through incompetence, political interference, and strategic blindness. By the time they finally got jets into combat in meaningful numbers, it was too late. The war was already lost. The wonder weapons they'd hoped would save them became expensive museum pieces for the Allies to study and learn from. The HE-280, the world's first jet fighter, was killed by the same chaos and dysfunction that killed Nazi Germany as a whole. And that's the real story. Not a story of technical failure. The technology worked. Not a story of cowardice or lack of effort. German engineers and pilots did everything they could. But a story of a fundamentally broken system that couldn't take advantage of the innovations it created. And that's it. That's the story of Germany's jet fighters. A story of missed opportunities, of what could have been, of technology that came too late to matter. If you want to see more deep dives into World War II history, into the stories that don't usually get told, matter of fact, I've got a video about the flying coffin. You can check that out next by clicking up here, and I'll catch you over there.